And efficiency being an end result of, for example, making the work easier, right? That's a core Toyota principle. When we design and improve work to make it easier to do, safety and quality and productivity are outcomes of that. Where a lot of Western businesses, as much as you can generalize, and this would include healthcare, like they focus primarily on efficiency, or they focus primarily on cost, and that can have really bad effects then on safety and quality and customer satisfaction and employee satisfaction.
Welcome to Clicks and Bricks Podcast. We talk about the entrepreneur mindset.
If you get one shot at this, what kind of shot are you going to take?
If we forget who we are, they're going to forget who you are.
You've got an adversity story that's out of this world.
Everything from that Main Street brick and mortar to that billion-dollar manufacturer.
Welcome back to Clicks and Bricks. Today we've got Mark with us. He is a serial author and he's a podcast host for the podcast My Favorite Mistake. How are you doing today, Mark?
I'm doing well. You make me chuckle hearing serial author. Like you always hear either serial entrepreneur or serial killer.
Oh,
so,
boy.
I mean, it's a weird prefix, but okay. I've written multiple books, so that is true. Yes. Absolutely.
And this is quite interesting because your podcast is My Favorite Mistake. And this is actually our second episode that we're shooting together. It's a little embarrassing. We did an episode, Mark and I spent a little over, probably about an hour together and just talking, had a great conversation, but something happened and it didn't get recorded. So this is actually our second time that we're getting together. And thank you so much for understanding and doing this again with us, because I did have a great time.
Well, I did, and it gives me a chance to reflect on, the idea, hey, everyone makes mistakes. I have made mistakes. I forgot to hit record once. Yeah. Like I've interviewed more than 700 people. I've done more than 700 interviews across a couple different podcasts over the last 15 years. And one time I forgot to hit record. So mistakes happen. And I remember that guest, and I'm trying to remember who it was. It'll come back to me at some point. Maybe I'll dig through emails. But that guest, and like I owned up to it. And that's something I try to emphasize through the podcast and my book project on this is we almost need to make mistakes. And then when we do, there's really no better alternative than owning up to it, admitting it. The guest in that point couldn't have been any more gracious, right? So there's a lesson of being gracious and kind to yourself and not beating yourself up, but trying to learn and say, well, how could I prevent repeating that mistake? I try to show the same grace toward others. I'm not perfect at it, but look, if it wasn't intentional, the problem more often is then, repeating the same mistake over and over again. That's where we might look at it differently,
Absolutely. And I think it's kind of humorous that we can we invested a lot of time and our time is valuable. And it's really easy to let go of something simple, like very easily if you're just open, honest. Sorry it happened. It won't happen again is probably the most powerful statement you can say when you mess something up. But we get really frustrated when somebody cuts us off in traffic, right? those really quick seconds is when people get frustrated the most, I think.
And does that hand going up in the rearview mirror say, I made a mistake? Or is it a passive aggressive, thank you for letting me cut you off?
Yes, absolutely.
And was it a hand or a finger? It's hard to see sometimes.
The world is a wildly dynamic place and we get to live in it every day, which is super cool. You have a podcast, My Favorite Mistake, and you've written some books. Can you just give us your line? You've gotten, I think you're 5 books in and you're on your 6th, or you 6 in on your 7th?
The book, and as we're recording this on October 22nd, I am thousands of words into the book and I have it outlined. I haven't decided on the title.
Okay.
The podcast is called My Favorite Mistake, which in a way was a bit of a mistake. Maybe we can come back to that if you want, but I'm going to come up with a title for the book and we can share that with people. But my first book was published in 2008. It was called Lean Hospitals. And the subtitle of the book is Improving Quality, Patient Safety, and Employee Engagement. So it's really it's a book about improving healthcare as it's delivered in organizations. That's a lot of the consulting and the work that I do. Co-authored a book with Joe Schwartz, someone I've known a long time. The book's called Healthcare Kaizen. Kaizen is a Japanese word that means continuous improvement. So this book is about creating a culture of continuous improvement in healthcare. I think it was a mistake to use the word Kaizen in the title of the book. Japanese word, and if people aren't searching for that word, I have a hypothesis that's a thought experiment. If we called the book something like Creating a Culture of Continuous Improvement in Healthcare, okay, that's wordy, but like maybe it would have sold better with a different title. I don't know. And then we did a version of that book called The Executive Guide to Healthcare Kaizen. We doubled down on the mistake, but the first mistake in the first book was, hey, the book's too big, it's too expensive. So we did an executive guide version. And then I was the author and editor of a book called Practicing Lean. And that's where I kind of got on this path of this idea of learning from professional mistakes and sharing those with others. And I had 15 other authors who wrote a chapter kind of on that theme of, when you start something new and you're practicing, you're not as good at it as you're going to be 20 years later, or you hope you get better at it. So it's a book of kind of reflections of like, here's things I wish I had understood better or things I wish I had done better. And then book number 5 was a little bit different direction, book called Measures of Success. The subtitle there, React Less, Lead Better, Improve More. This book was, it's a broader management book. So there are stories from all sorts of different industries, software companies, manufacturing, healthcare, and beyond about, how we can use performance measures and metrics in a way that's most helpful for improvement and success. And then there's the book title around, lessons learned and stories from my guests. The book, it's focused on how do we get better at learning from mistakes, both as individuals and organizations.
I love it. So step back a little bit for the audience and the people that aren't familiar with Lean, and I'm familiar with Lean Startup and some Lean stuff. Like we're in second grade, can you explain what is Lean?
So your Lean Startup is part of the family tree. It really started with this phrase, lean production, in the late 1980s. That was a term that was meant to describe and kind of generalize the Toyota production system, to describe what was different about Toyota's approach to management and improvement, describing it in a way that would appeal to people who were outside the auto industry. For example, I started my career in the Detroit area at General Motors in the mid-90s, and nobody at GM would want to really admit that they were copying Toyota for a whole bunch of pride and history reasons. So this phrase lean production was meant to be a positive descriptor of what Toyota does. Using the word lean may have been a mistake, right? In terms of what the word lean implies, or what the connotations of that. And so then, as these methods for improving and managing and leading, spread into other industries, you might hear it described as lean healthcare. There are people I know that have applied these methods in different levels of government, and they would call it lean government. And then, Eric Ries, the author of The Lean Startup, brings some of these same ideas and approaches into startups. But part of the core is really about thinking, about problem solving. A startup or an entrepreneur is a problem solver, or you better be. You better not just have an idea or a solution. You want to connect that solution to a problem that people are willing to spend money to fix. So that's part of the connection to the realm of startups. But the thought process and some of the leadership styles and the principles are really similar and really transferable. Right.
So I know the word lean, if you don't know the process, it just seems like running super, super thin, right? Is what kind of it implies if you don't dig deeper. I think my best way to describe it in programming is very quickly act, measure, modify, repeat. Act, measure, modify, repeat. Just consistently and keep doing that and as quickly as possible. And don't get upset when you have to redo work, right? I guess redoing work is a bad thing, but if it's a mistake, it for improvements. Yes.
I mean, if it's a mistake, we want to learn from the mistake, which means not punishing people for mistakes. That's an organizational dynamic for sure. But back to the word lean, there are dictionary definitions that say, the implication is we don't have enough, right? Where what was meant coming from Toyota, let's say if we look at staffing levels in a hospital, quote unquote, lean hospital would have the right people and doing the right work, the right way, the right place, the right time. It's the right staffing levels. Right. Now, Toyota had far higher productivity than other automakers, but that's because the design of their factories and the design of their products allowed for the productivity, right? The productivity was an end result of all of these practices. Now, if GM were to try to copy Toyota by just firing a bunch of people and assuming that would lead to the same productivity level, it doesn't work that way, right? And so the problem then with the word is, we try to bring it into healthcare, and people will say things like this, like, "Oh, we're already lean. We don't have enough people as it is." And I'm like, "Oh gosh,
right. that's actually where your mind goes immediately, right? Is that I don't have enough, but it's really just wildly efficient."
And efficiency being an end result of, for example, making the work easier, right? That's a core Toyota principle. When we design and improve work to make it easier to do, safety and quality and productivity are outcomes of that. Where a lot of Western businesses, as much as you can generalize, and this would include healthcare, like they focus primarily on efficiency, or they focus primarily on cost, and that can have really bad effects then on safety and quality and customer satisfaction and employee satisfaction. So yeah, the word, at best, it can be a starting point for discussion of, well, hey, tell me what you mean about lean. At worst, people they've already made their minds up,
right,
when they've heard the word lean. I don't want that. We have shortages of supplies. I'm like, well, lean is meant to solve that problem. Well, we're already too lean. Patients wait forever for care. That's a problem we're trying to solve, and that organizations do solve using this methodology. Where again, it's probably a mistake to call it lean. Like if they had called it effective production,
yes,
that's really what we're going for. And so then we say, okay, I've written a book called Effective Hospitals. That's not as scary, right?
Right. So I know I've got these for every company I have. I come up with a list of core values. Sometimes I call it a core value. Sometimes I call it a SMAC. And in my IT company, one of our core values is that if we can automate it, we do. Right? If it can be automated, we automate it.
Mm-hmm.
And for a lot of my staff, that is beautiful. But some people get nervous when you say we're going to automate this task. Mm-hmm. And I've even had an employee give me a bad review on Glassdoor because we automated the job and then offered them a different position, right? Saying, hey, this job it's gone now. We'd love to keep you on, but this, here's 3 different positions that would, I think you'd be a good fit for.
Yeah.
How do you, in lean and you're automating jobs, obviously you're gonna need less people or potentially less people or be more productive with the people you have. How do you, is there any tricks communicating to the staff to get them all on board? Because it's really challenging to implement new process in a company when you don't have employee buy-in.
You're absolutely right. And there are many, I think components of what you bring up there. One is that if automation is leading to job loss, people are going to fight like hell to interfere with the automation, physical automation in a factory or technical, software automation. I was at General Motors in the 90s, and this mindset still exists in some places today. Like if you think your workers are the problem, or you have a really bad relationship with your workers, which I would say that's a management problem, right? It's usually described unfairly, back to words, a labor problem. I mean, well, that's one part of the equation, right? Whether there's a union or not. But General Motors, they were just automating to get rid of people because they had a bad relationship with their union and they blamed their people. Toyota uses automation, but their guiding principle generally is they will automate a job if it's to eliminate a safety risk, right? So there's certain work that's just really, really repetitive. And even though there are strategies to rotate jobs and things to reduce that, if work is really just mundane and monotonous, you might want to automate that. That probably applies in a technology company. If the quality is measurably better through automation, they will do that. So if you look at decisions in an auto factory like welding, certain types of welding is done better by a robot.
Right.
There are still certain types of welding, and this would apply to painting, where it's actually better done by a person. People are more flexible in the way they do their work, and there are pros and cons here. But even back to that principle of saying here's how I've heard it described in healthcare. Your job may change, but we're going to protect your career, like a hospital CEO saying it that way. I would argue that's a better way to do it than driving layoffs. Lean is probably better as a growth strategy, right? So General Motors was a shrinking business. Toyota was a growing business. That was part of the dynamic there. But that said, even if investing in a person and retraining them and giving them a new opportunity, logically, that sounds great. Emotionally, that might really hurt. And somebody might not want or be able to accept that, right? People are complicated. I would applaud you for doing what sounds like the right thing. That doesn't mean it's always going to be easy for people, right?
Right. And then there's a large number of people in the world that applied for the job that they have because they're comfortable doing it, and they're not
right.
They're just not cohesive enough or willing to, one of the greatest things in the world to me, I value opportunity more than almost anything. And I scratch my head when people don't value opportunity, right? They value consistency before opportunity. And that's a big number. It's a big number of people out there in the world.
And we're wired differently. And here's one example I would use. There are probably people we know, or there are people out there that will literally eat the same thing for lunch every day.
Yes.
I would hate that, quite personally, right? Yep. So if what seems like an opportunity to you or I, so then there's middle ground. I eat different things, but within a certain limited range, right? And then I'm pretty adventurous. I will go and try some new cuisine, new to me from some country. I'm adventurous that way. I may or may not like it. I might say, well, that was a mistake, but I didn't know, so I wouldn't blame myself for making the mistake. Now, I don't like if there's a food I know I don't like strangely enough, olives, right? My wife loves olives. So again, we're wired differently, and I will continually here, let me try. And I've got to learn at some point that's a mistake, because every time I try again, I still don't like olives, So
never gonna do it.
There's different comfort levels with change. But I think some of it comes back to culture and having a culture of learning from mistakes. People might be afraid to try a new job because they're not going to be good at it right away. And they might fear how how's the company going to treat me? I was really good at that old job, and I took a lot of pride in that.
Right.
How are they going to treat me? I think ideally we have to realize if you're new to the job, even if we've trained you really well, mistakes are going to happen. Let's learn from them. Let's be open about that. Again, logically, that might make sense, but people then might feel that loss, that sense of pride that they used to have.
Right.
So we can do all the right things, I think, the right way, and it still might not satisfy everybody. And I think that's just part of how it goes.
Right. I had a supervisor, a boss, at one point in my life, and we're still really good friends. When I worked for him, every quarter, he made everybody change desks. No matter, and I would get so angry. I'm like, why am I taking a day to take all my stuff up, pick it up, and move it to a different desk? And it seems so arbitrary to me in my 20s, right?
Or a waste of time.
What I know now, what he was doing is he was prepping the entire company just be okay with change. We're going to be changing all the time, right? It's okay. You're going to change, and you'll a day, and you'll be back in the groove. Do you have any kinds of tricks or strategies that business owners can do to help get their employees know and be just comfortable with, hey, things might change on me, and that'll be okay?
Yeah. So, there's a couple of things that come to mind. One, I would call it a strategy, not a trick. So thank you for giving that word to work with. The one thing Joe Schwartz and I were taught, and we've learned and we've applied in organizations from this book, Healthcare Kaizen. I think a really powerful strategy when it comes to getting people more comfortable with change is taking baby steps, starting small and encouraging like if you were to make a blanket request in a lot of organizations, like, hey, we want your ideas for improvement. People often think it's assumed like, okay, I'm going to think of $1 million idea. So those are few and far between. That puts a lot of pressure on people. They can't think of one. And then they're like, I'm not good at improvement. I'm not creative. If you take it to an extreme of someone struggling and say, think of the smallest possible improvement you could make. Well, then they can think of something. Then you can get some practice testing an improvement, seeing if it worked. Thinking of these cycles of improvement, people build comfort and competence. They get more comfortable with problem solving and improvement. They get better at it. Then they start working their way up toward, let's say, larger, bigger changes. So we can't just tell people to be comfortable with change. We can help them experience change in a way where they convince themselves.
Right.
It's more comfortable. Now, it's still going to be scary. And another thing I've learned, and I give credit to clinicians that I've worked with in healthcare, change is scary to people. Like this is innate in our biology and our brains and evolution or whatever you want to point to. Change is scary, even when it's logically to our benefit, right? Right. So we have to help people work through change and realizing, so like one phrase I really try not to use, and I'll try to coach others through, is this phrase, resistance to change. And we'll point that at other people, like, oh, they're resistant to change. Like, clinicians and counselors who are trying to work people through change in their life would recommend using a different word. And that word is ambivalence. Okay, it's a $20 word there, right? That people aren't resistant to change. They are ambivalent about change. And what that word ambivalent means is the reality of they have reasons to change and they have reasons not to change.
Right.
And if those things are sort of in balance, and like we may say, okay, I'm not changing. So then what you can do as a counselor or as a leader is help people work through basically convincing themselves that the benefits, the reasons to change outweigh the reasons not to change. And as leaders, we can help eliminate some of the risks. People are afraid of like, well, if I try it this new way and I'm terrible at it, it's going to hurt my reputation or I'm going to get fired. Well, you can try to eliminate some of those risks. But what you can't do is just say, well, you need to be brave. Like again, easier said than done. We can create conditions in which it's safer for people to try new things, make it safer for them to speak up, make it safer for them to learn a new job. We can help them work through accepting change instead of trying to force it on them.
Right. Absolutely. And unfortunately, even though the phrase, the devil I know, is very powerful, right? People can be in a situation they're not comfortable. They're not happy in, but they know it's their current position. So they don't want to, and they're okay with it. They're somewhat comfortable, even though it's kind of painful. They don't want to make that change.
I'm not a psychologist, but I think for personal experience or, just through experience with others, people can get comfortable with a suboptimal situation.
Absolutely.
And that doesn't mean they should make a change, but if the discomfort with the current situation isn't high enough. So let's say, I talk to people who are friends or like a lot of my podcast guests, maybe 10% of them, their favorite mistake from their workplace was involving a job change. And it could be, I took a job and that job was a mistake. It could be, I was in a bad situation and I quit too soon. And maybe I should have stuck with it. Or the mistake is I stayed with it too long. Or, so, it's hard to try to anticipate, am I trying to avoid a mistake or am I willing to take a reasonable risk? There's different ways of framing it, right? So if somebody is really prioritizing on not making a mistake, that means not trying anything new. And again, it could be a mistake to stay in a bad job situation. But there's lots of people who will say something to the effect of, if you're not making mistakes, you're not trying hard enough. So now when we think about the organizational dynamic, if you as a leader insist that every new thing that the organization tries is a success, people probably aren't really going to try anything. How can you be innovative when people are afraid to quote unquote fail or make a mistake. And I think that's where we can help people before we launch a product and before we spend a ton of money. Like, how do you test the idea? This comes back to lean startup. I have a hypothesis. How do we test the hypothesis in a way where we would rather realize sooner than later that's a mistake? And now we can either kill the initiative or we can adjust and evolve the idea instead of being stubborn, right? So final thing to that, though, is like this mindset connecting from Toyota into healthcare or to startups is the difference between knowing the answer and having a hypothesis. And that might sound like obnoxious language.
It's important.
How often do we really truly know something? Like I have this coffee mug full of water. I know if I let go of it that it's going to fall.
Yes.
Coming on to be a guest with you on this podcast, I can have a hypothesis that it's going to be interesting and enjoyable for me. And you have a hypothesis that I'm going to say something that's interesting and or helpful to your audience.
Right.
But any of those hypotheses could be wrong. Right. And so let's say 5 minutes in the interview, if I'm just being a jerk, you might just pull the plug and say,
right.
No,
so,
let's.
I know that, and the narrative is so frequently on the side that we're talking about right now, on the people that are resistant to change or afraid of change, and we all know that fear can be a big liar, and you got to figure out that. Yeah. But is there the other side of the fence too? The guy that just moves too quickly and is too adept to change. That seems to me like if. I tend to be that person myself, and I know a lot of people in that bucket. Is there a way to diagnose that, hey, I'm going too fast or I'm trying too many things at once?
You're right. So there could be, like this idea that we're going to expect mistakes and recognize them and learn from them doesn't give us license to be reckless, and there's a balance there. So, generally, if you want to be open, and here's part of the mindset is this idea, I could be wrong. And that doesn't mean like an unhealthy level of self-doubt to where you're not moving forward.
Right.
But I could be wrong means I move forward, but I'm looking for feedback and input, right? None of us work in a vacuum. So if somebody in our life or in our work is saying, hey, I don't know, you should think about that more, or they express their concern. Hopefully, this comes back to culture. Hopefully, we have a workplace culture where someone's willing to speak up and think like you can succeed for a while being surrounded by yes men or yes women, but at some point that's going to come back to bite you, right? So, I think being open to feedback, but then more importantly, go and test your idea. Like this is a powerful lesson from Toyota. Small tests of change. And ideally, like not doing the focus group thing, but like if I'm thinking about different titles for my book, like I think a classic lean startup way of doing this would be putting up a couple of different landing pages and trying to see which of those pages gets the most clicks for someone saying, hey, I want to be notified when this book is published. Now, that's not exactly the same as someone giving you their credit card number. Right. But you could test an idea. Like I wish we had tested back to the book title, Healthcare Kaizen, which I'm now pretty convinced that was a mistake. I could have, should have tested that idea in different ways before moving forward with it. So I think, there's another trap we have to be careful on. If we're moving too fast, like have we really locked in on the first idea that we have, as opposed to exploring alternatives? Like it's a classic Toyota kind of coaching question to ask, what other solutions have you considered? Right. So if I was saying, hey, Ken, you're my publisher, I want to call this book Healthcare Kaizen. Totally fair question. Say, well, what other titles have you considered? Like, help me understand the thought process of how you came to think this was the best book title. And then again, instead of it being a battle of opinions, how do you go test the idea in some small way in the marketplace?
Right. Wonderful. All right. I've got a pretty big question for you.
Okay.
I think that the majority of the world thinks that a manager's job is to come in the morning, make sure the staff is all sitting in their seats at the right time, making sure their tasks are all done, making sure they've logged in and logged out. Is it a manager's job to also coach their employees?
Yes. Yes, and I would argue that's the primary.
That's their primary job.
Is coaching and developing your people, right? So, I mean, there's this element of, sure, as a leader, you're the founder of a company, you're putting a certain structure in place,
right?
Like, I mean, I use the word balance a lot. I think there's balance to be found where, the old model of quote unquote command and control, that clearly doesn't work,
right?
But take it to another extreme. Like, I don't think a workplace is really a democracy. Like, people having input and debating and discussing on the merits of the idea as opposed to who's most senior in the organization. Like, there's still a time and a place where a manager might, an owner, a CEO might make an unpopular opinion,
right?
And they can live or die by that, by the consequences of that decision. But so I think, a leader helps create structure, or, the language, I would use is that, leaders are responsible for the systems, which includes culture and the design of work, the design of our product, what markets we work in. There's elements of strategy.
Right.
And we might get input from people on, but again, at some point, part of your job as CEO is to have vision, right? That's part of the problem with focus groups. There's expressions going all the way back to like Henry Ford or Steve Jobs. If you go strictly based on what the customer tells you they want, you might not be really innovative. If you only listen to what your employees say, they might not share the vision that you have that puts you in the position of being CEO. But that said, I think we want to be requesting input and making it safe for people to give input. So it's a participatory workplace, is the one word that people would use. People are highly engaged. They're safe to speak up. They're safe to disagree. But you might not put everything up to a vote. Japanese businesses have a reputation or a stereotype as being very, very consensus driven. That can be good. It can also be bad, and that it might be very, 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 very slow. Right. So where do you find the balance between getting input, respecting that input, listening to that input, incorporating it, but maybe not all of it? Right. But either way, like I think, back to your original question, we don't want people to be cogs in a machine or drones, or, to have someone say like, they tell us check our brain at the door. Like, I hate hearing that.
I know I've been guilty of it before. I've hired people for jobs that I didn't know how to do. And they would say, what's my job? I'm like, well, I hired you for sales. Go sell something. Right.
There's something to be said for setting direction without dictating all the detail.
Right.
Right. And some people want to come into a job where their mindset ingrained on them in some way is, hey, just tell me what to do and I'll do it.
Right.
And then there are other people who would find that awful and restrictive and like, hey, Ken, I want you to set direction. I want you to tell me what's important. I want to tell you what our priorities are, and then let me run with it.
Right.
But then there's feedback loops where you're giving feedback and coaching, and right.
Hopefully always having feedback loops. I think that's a huge piece that people that I see missing a lot of times is, hey, here's the rule, do this thing. And there's no feedback loop, right? There's the standard is the 80-20 rule. Really, it's probably more 95, 98 to 2 is really what happens most of the time, right? But that 5 to 2%, 2 to 5% of variance is employees get lost. They get stuck, right? And they don't know what to do. So if you don't give them a way to communicate that or open to feedback to you of like, hey, what do I do in this weird case scenario? And hopefully that becomes a new standard, right? That becomes a variation of the standard. And then you'll find some other thing later down the road.
Right.
They tend to get stuck. I think it's important to diagnose those kinds of traits early and put them in the proper roles, right?
Right.
You have frontline phone support in your company, probably, right? And that's the guy or girl It's, hey, tell me what to do and I'll do it, right? Here's your job. Answer the phone. This is what you say. Right. And then there's the thinkers that are engineers and other things.
Yeah. I mean, people want direction. And I think you don't want to let people struggle because they don't know exactly what their job is and they don't know what their expectations are. Then they do the best they can to figure it out. And then a year later, like this is a problem with annual reviews as opposed to more continuous coaching. Let's say someone is like, they didn't tell me how to do my job, but I figured it out and I think I'm doing well and doing the best I can. And then at the end of the year, they get the review and then they're told, oh, you suck. Like what a blow that is. Right. And I mean, that's not constructive feedback, but if that's kind of like what they're hearing, like, well, but then you'd say, well, as a leader, why did you let them underperform for so long? Were you unaware of it or were you unable to coach them up and help them along? Or to your point, Ken, sometimes a job is just not a good fit for an individual and their personality or their experience, right?
I find that to be the case very frequently, and then making an attempt to usher them into the right job. I have more times than I can count made the mistake of trying to elevate somebody, or what I thought would be elevate them, move them off of frontline and up into engineering or something along those lines, and they just weren't the right fit. And it ended up being a giant mistake at the end of the day of pushing these people. Luckily, I've gotten to the point where we do it now on a trial basis, and we let them go back to their original job if it didn't work out, right?
So that mitigates the risk of making the mistake, is doing some sort of trial period or interim or there's this question of you put somebody into a management position and it seems like a bad fit. It could be a mistake to give up on them too soon. It could be a mistake to stick with them too long. So it's hard, but then hopefully you're learning from it and you think of like your selection criteria. The one mistake organizations make over and over again is that they keep promoting the best individual contributor. Like at some point you got to learn from that if that's what the dynamic is and stop making the same mistake.
Yeah. What's the problem with why shouldn't I promote the best contributor?
I'm not saying I'm not saying they would automatically make a bad manager, but some people learn quickly they don't want to manage other people, right? They were a better fit to the organization as an individual contributor. Right. There are times when, I think part of the mistake is when organizations, and I've had podcast guests talk about this, where like, oh, I made so many mistakes when I became a manager for the first time. But back to your question about coaching and development, maybe they were thrown into a leadership job, not told what the expectations were about how to manage. They do their best to pay attention to how their boss operates, and they try to mirror that behavior, good, bad, or ugly. If they're struggling, they're not getting coaching like that. That's part of the problem, right? So it might not be just the variable of it was individual contributors. You could have taken anybody and put them in a situation where they're not getting clear expectations, clear feedback, coaching and development. Maybe anybody would fail in that situation, or most everybody would fail until you find someone uniquely able and willing to navigate those rough waters.
Okay.
That might be part of the learning, hopefully, that we would figure out over time.
Absolutely, Mark. So you've got the book Measuring Success or something along those lines. And
Measures of Success.
Of Success.
Yeah.
And you've touched a little bit on maybe annual reviews aren't the best way to do it. Right?
Mm-hmm.
What are some managers out there scratching their head saying, you're right. I evaluate this employee for I take 1 week a year. I look at all my staff and I grade them.
Yeah.
Based on some arbitrary information I have for the past 30 days, really in my head. I don't recall what he did a year ago. Yeah. Maybe I have some metrics or something along those lines. But this is very typical, and it's been going on for at least 20, 30 years, right? It's been the standard. Is there a different way? And what are some of the other ways to have that more consistent nurturing of your employee that measures their success?
Well, so one question would be, what are the criteria you're using to evaluate somebody's success? Is it measures? Then if it's measures, that can get dysfunctional in different ways. Like if you're measuring salespeople based on the number of deals you sold, well, maybe somebody sold a bunch of really small, unprofitable deals, right? So people will work to the measure. So you have to be careful about that. You have to make sure that the evaluation is not just based on opinions and politics. There's risk of that. There is all kinds of dysfunction that comes with, the old stacked ranking approach of ranking, or I think even worse, this was an old Jack Welch thing, like you got to fire your bottom 10% every year, or you've got to fire a certain number of people every year. Well, what if you have a team where everybody's awesome? What loss to the company to fire one out of those 10 people? And then do you hire someone just for oh, well, that's who I'm going to fire next year?
Right. Yeah. One of my core values is our employees are our most valuable asset in the company. Yeah. Why would you fire it? To me, that's even your lowest performing employee has some tribal knowledge. I'm assuming has some tribal knowledge about their position that's not properly documented, that they're doing something to get through the day that management probably doesn't know about.
I mean, and I wouldn't say never fire somebody, but that should be a last resort. Or if you've got somebody who's really misbehaving, then at some point you go back and look at your hiring process and say, how do we better screen people out? Viewing it as a hiring mistake, not just a bad person, right? But there are a growing number of companies in recent years, big and small, that are abolishing the annual review. Now, they might be replacing it with more continual coaching and feedback that might be documented in some sort of, formal HR kind of system. I think one problem with the annual review is that it's so infrequent. Now, we don't want to take the same bureaucracy. So in hospitals, there's all these complaints about how time consuming it is to write up the annual review documentation. You don't want to take that same huge burden of questionable value and now start doing it 4 times a year. Right. So at some point, maybe you've got to scale back the bureaucracy and the time involved, reduce the amount of time spent ranking people, and invest that time into coaching them up. There's one of the old quality gurus. He died 30 years ago, W. Edwards Deming. And, even back in the 80s, he was saying, get rid of the annual performance review. Well, what do we replace it with? He would say, replace it with leadership. He'd say the job of a leader is not to judge their people. The role of the leader is to help them succeed. Right. So that annual review, if it's good, bad, or, A, B, C, D, E ranking, or well, if an employee is getting a D letter grade, why weren't you coaching them up throughout the year? You want to help everybody succeed. That's not the old cliche about everyone's going to be above average. Well, no. But again, I think it's back to the role of leaders. And Toyota uses this language of the role of a leader is to develop their people first and foremost. And then that leads to all sorts of other good things that lead to long-term growth and profitability.
Okay. We use a tool called Bambi, and I'm not an affiliate of Bambi other than I'm a client. And every month, every manager gives just a satisfactory, unsatisfactory on their employee. Just really quickly, hey, every month, are they doing satisfactory? Or are they doing unsatisfactory? And if they're unsatisfactory, then that means there needs to be a conversation, right? At that point of, hey, something's going on and we need to talk about it. And, 3 unsatisfactories consistently, then I'm going to get involved at that point, right? Then the manager's going to come in and say, hey, what's going on here? This is not, something's wrong in the system that we need to fix, right? So
yes,
I think it's really cool.
Actually, sorry.
Unfortunately, though, I still have these government compliances and these compliancy issues where you have to do that formal review every year. I found that just essay style works for me, and I don't have to do this grading them on a scale, a 5-star scale.
Yeah. I mean, you need a paper trail if you do decide you need to move someone out of the business so that you don't get sued, right? I mean, that's part of a reality. And, you want to make sure that you're, not inadvertently discriminating, or at least giving the appearance of discrimination, right?
Right.
Making sure that there's not bias slipping into some of these decisions. But yeah, you've got to have the conversation. And then this comes back to the question of how are we developing leaders? A lot of times people are really uncomfortable having those conversations of trying to point out, here's a gap in your performance, or here's a gap in the behaviors you're exhibiting compared to our standards. Let's have that uncomfortable conversation and figure out how to coach you up. I've seen people where I would say the organization has really failed them if a leader's talking about an employee instead of talking to them. That's failing the employee. Yes. Don't just I've seen, unfortunately, leaders badmouth an employee and they're not giving that feedback directly to the employee. Like, how unfair. And then I'm not naming names here, but I'm thinking of a specific situation of where this person's not given clear feedback about what they need to be doing differently or better. They're hearing inklings of it. They're trying to schedule meetings with the leader, and then the leader doesn't meet with them. And then at some point they get told, like, we're letting you go. And it's just really unfair to not give clear feedback and give someone an opportunity to improve. And it's really dumb for the organization.
It is. And be quite frank, I've done it myself, right? I've fallen victim of that in my younger years. The book that helped me a lot with this was Radical Candor. Mm-hmm. And Radical Candor, just like the other sentence where, we're saying that rewarding failure is an excuse just to constantly fail. Radical candor is not an excuse to just be a jerk all the time to people. Right. But it is, exactly. How do I, and really understanding who you are and how to be candorous with your staff, right? I have to walk really lightly. I'm a big guy. I'm boisterous, and I tend to be aggressive. So I tend to turn people off when I'm giving them my candor or I'm telling them about something. So I really have to tiptoe around it, where other people could be a little more blunt with their words and not being as hurtful.
And there's positional authority. If you're a CEO, you might think, I'm a guy that anyone could talk to and they can tell me what they think. And reality might be very different.
Yes.
Right. So at some point, and there are ways of trying to survey the organization and kind of calibrate the leader's perception of what's often described now as psychological safety. Do people feel safe to disagree with the boss, for example?
Yes.
And leaders tend to overestimate the level of safety they've created, because who wants to say or think, I've created an environment where people don't feel safe to speak up.
Right. My wife is currently going through this, and it's hilarious, right? Because she's a sweet woman. She's she's only about 2 years back into the workforce after our kids. And she runs one of our businesses, and she just last year became the general manager. So for the first time, she's got 19-year-old front desk staff, right? And she actually said to me, she goes, they're scared of me, and I don't know why. Like, well, you're their boss, and you're super sweet, and they're 19, they're young, they're just watching their words. They don't know they've not been trained yet on how to even interact with management, especially someone that's as open as you are.
Or if they're new, they haven't built up trust yet. That can take time.
This is their first job, right? Yeah. Their very first job. They're nervous. They're scared anyway. So I thought it was super cute that my wife was like, these 19-year-old girls are afraid of me, and I don't understand why. And I'm like, well, it's simply because you're their boss. No other reason. And they look at authority in a different way.
I've seen this in healthcare where, and this is tough, where leaders are trying to change and practice some new behaviors that might come from this quote unquote lean management style. So one of those ideas would be, get out of your office, go understand what's really happening, go build relationships with people at the front line. And at first that's everyone's terrified because the leader is uncomfortable with this. So like, I don't know if I know how to build good connections with people. And what if I say the wrong thing? And then the employers see the boss and are like, oh God, what's wrong? Like that's going to be their natural response for a while. If the only time they've ever seen the boss before, they get conditioned kind of like Pavlov's dog
right.
of like the boss is here. What's the matter? And then all you can do is like over time work on building trust with people and try to build those relationships to where they can be more comfortable to create. There are things leaders can do, thankfully, to not just wish psychological safety into existence. There are things you can do as a leader to actually grow and build the level of psychological safety.
Yeah, it's hard. It's super hard. I know that I keep going back to this memory of going to an employee for the first time and said, hey, we need to have a conversation. And it would be a great conversation that we're having. Meet me in the conference room in 10 minutes. And they show up crying.
Yeah.
What's going on? Like, no, we're talking about a promotion. I'm like, well, I didn't know. You've never called me to the conference room before.
Right. Well, I mean, it could be, we don't know the baggage or the past history of each individual. Maybe the last time that happened to them at a previous job, they got laid off.
Right.
So we don't know that.
Right? I really like to tell them, especially if it's good news, I tell them like, hey, we're going to meet in the conference room. This is what it's going to be about, right? We're going to talk about great stuff and we're going to do new plans and things like that. Or just making sure that you're meeting them more frequently because it is, especially if you got long hallways, walking down long hallways with employees to a conference room to have a conversation is wildly cumbersome. So
but I'm reminded of a time I had to give feedback to somebody. I guess she was basically my boss, and there was like a Friday afternoon. She sent a message saying like, hey, need some time with you on Monday morning. We need to talk, and I worried about it all weekend. And I then we laughed about it and I gave her some feedback. I'm like, at least the way I'm wired, please don't do that to me again. Now, to be fair, I should have spoke up on Friday and said, well, hey, and this is something I learned. I can ask, can you give me some inkling about what the meeting's going to be about?
Right.
So
that's great advice for an employee. If you're watching and you're an employee and your boss asks you for a meeting and you're kind of uncomfortable about that, you're totally within your rights to say, hey, do you mind give me a little feedback so I'm not worrying? Just be honest. Say, this is a little out of character for you to ask me on a meeting for a Monday on a Friday evening. I don't want to worry all weekend. Can you give me a little bit of feedback on what the meeting's about? And I think you'll find most bosses will be like, oh, shoot, I screwed up. I should have given you more feedback or more input on what this was about.
Yeah. Maybe it is something bad. And if they are squirrely about it, maybe you should be worrying and looking at your resume or calling that recruiter you haven't talked to in a while. But I have a bad habit, and this is a mistake, of kind of going too quickly in my mind to worst case scenario.
Right.
And this isn't a therapy session here, but at least I've tried to recognize that habit and start checking that assumption. Right.
Yeah. I tend to just go I try to really focus on the best case scenario for whatever I'm going to go into. So
we're wired differently. Right?
Well, it's been years of beating myself up to try to get there. I'm not perfect at it, but I'm getting better every day.
Well, and that's okay to admit. And that comes back to a healthy culture of learning from mistakes.
Yes.
Of recognizing it, acknowledging it, reflecting on it long enough to figure out, okay, I'm going to do something differently next time, and then not beat yourself up about it.
Yes. All right, Mark. So we're shooting this in October of 22. It's going to be released probably in March of 23 towards the end. And that should be pretty close to when your next book's coming out. We don't know if it's going to be on the shelves then or pretty close to be getting there. Can you give us a little sneak peek about what the new book's about?
So it's a book based on, I've interviewed at this point roughly 200 people from different professions and walks of life, CEOs, startup people, retired pro athletes, entertainers, people from lots of different countries. And I asked them all the same question, like from a workplace perspective, what's your favorite mistake? And you start seeing certain patterns and themes, and there are some really compelling stories, because I think it's really helpful. Like I think the benefit is not learning from a mistake. Kevin Harrington, who was a shark on Shark Tank,
right? The
first episode or the first season of that show, he was my first guest. The combination of strength and humility that he demonstrated by coming on, everyone loves talking about their successes, right?
Right.
And so the fact that he would tell a story, kind of early in his businesses, a mistake that almost put the company under, but he learned from it. He made some changes. Like, better to make that mistake early and to learn from it than to make that mistake later. Like, I think that's reassuring to people if they think to be successful, I need to avoid mistakes. I think actually the opposite is true. To be successful, you need to learn from your mistakes and stop repeating them, right? And so there are all these different stories, not to prevent making Kevin Harrington's direct mistake, but to learn a little bit about how to think about mistakes as individuals. How do we get better at learning from those mistakes? And then when we're part of a team or a workplace, how do we create a culture where we feel safe talking about mistakes and in a way where we learn and get better, instead of having a culture of fear where we drive mistakes underground. If they're hidden and we don't know what they are, we can't learn from them. So that's the book, is kind of going through the stories, the lessons learned. Like, I kind of like at this point in October, I've finally got more momentum because I think I've kind of finally found a framework to structure the book around, and not have it be just a collection of random stories. That's what listening to the podcast might be. But kind of this framework for thinking through, again, like as individuals, or if I'm a leader, if I'm a CEO, what behaviors can I model as a leader? Like, and I think it's very powerful. Like, if you work for a CEO who is willing to say things like, I don't know, I'm not sure, I made a mistake, that creates a very high level of psychological safety. And then when they reward the behaviors like that follow, not punishing people for mistakes. And I think that's really, that leads to a lot of success then as an organization. So I think there's different benefits. It's being written as a workplace book, but I think there would be a lot of, even if your workplace isn't on board with this idea of creating this culture, I think there's a lot of things we can do as individuals to get better at learning from mistakes. And then ideally, the real benefit would be creating that workplace culture of learning from mistakes.
I love it. I'm excited to read it when it comes out. I find it, if you're sitting at the bar telling war stories with your buddies, you're talking about your mistakes more than you're talking about your conquests, right? Generally, right? Hey, I really screwed this up, but I figured it out at the end, right? And those are the best stories, I think.
And that's the key. That's the redemption story that comes from, I'm not having people come on the podcast and browbeating them for, why the hell did you make that mistake? That's not the spirit of it at all. But for one, thank you for telling that story and being willing to do that. Thank you for sharing your reflections of how and what you learned and what you did differently. How do you build that culture? It's a blessing that people would be willing to even have that kind of conversation. So I think my guests are uniquely, again, it's like this combination of strength and humility, to be willing to do that. But then, just back to the title real quick, like I named the podcast My Favorite Mistake. It's an interesting phrase. It was partly inspired by the Sheryl Crow song, My Favorite Mistake. So here's the problem. When people go searching Apple or Spotify or whatever for My Favorite Mistake, they get the Sheryl Crow song. It dominates the search results.
Right.
And I could make this change. And had I called the podcast Our Favorite Mistakes, I would dominate that search term.
Right.
So
hindsight. And you can always change the name, but it's a lot of branding change.
I can. So here's the balance. If I think if I've decided that's a mistake, I shouldn't beat myself up for it, and I shouldn't beat myself up for not figuring it out sooner.
Right.
Now, if I don't take action on that knowledge, like you said, now I'm back to being ambivalent about change. I have reasons to change the name, and I have reasons not to, and I'll try to work through that.
Yeah, and at this point, to change the name is another investment. Right. And it's not an insignificant investment, right? It's fairly large investment to change the name of a brand, especially after 200 interviews, 300 interviews.
Yeah.
That's a lot of work, right? It's almost better to start in your head. I know I'm going through this at the moment. Just start another one with the proper name and keep moving forward.
Or it could be a mistake to have a book that has a different title than the podcast. So I need to think about that. So I could change the name of the podcast to Our Favorite Mistakes. But now if I end up calling the book something else, do I want to make another change on top of the change? So that's one of the reasons to not change it, like right now, today, when we end this call.
Right. Absolutely. Mark, I've had a blast talking with you. We're running short on time. Is there anything you'd like to leave the audience with before we go?
Well, thank you, Ken, for doing this. The first time that I'm going to repeat what the guest told me when I had to own up to, hey, I didn't hit record. Yeah. And we're going to do it again. They said, that's okay. We'll call the first one a practice session.
Absolutely.
So thank you for the opportunity to practice.
And thank you for understanding.
Hopefully what I shared this time was, and hopefully what I shared this time was better than the first time. Ken might be thinking, oh God, it was so much better that first go.
It's always better the first time, but it is what it is. And we move forward and we're going to make mistakes. I'm just grateful that the mistake that I made was with you and not somebody else, because this is right in your wheelhouse of understanding that. So thank you for your time today. I appreciate it.
So I answer your question. Well, thank you. I didn't answer your question of, I hope people will, think about mistakes, like not even your favorite, but even think about your most recent mistake. Like how did you discover it was a mistake? What was it? Was it a mistake because it was built on a bad assumption, bad information? Like, without beating yourself up, kind of think back to, why did I make the decision that I made? I thought it was a good decision at the time. What did I learn from that? And what might I do to prevent repeating that mistake? That's what I invite people to think about.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Mark. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ken.
Have a great day. Thanks for watching today's episode of Clicks and Bricks. Get to work.